Ha! You already know who this is, and you already know what I'm gonna say. It's time to talk more about Texas. In the last episode, we left James Fannin trying to save his two unruly officers from the trap they ran themselves into at Mission Refugio, and they just evacuated in the night under the cover of a heavy rain. Well, Eamon King and his wicked counterpart, William Ward, may have thought that they could run from General Urea, but they couldn't hide. You remember all those centralist ranchers that they had been raiding together? Well, it turns out that some of these ranchers saw King and Ward's departure that rainy night, and they decided to settle score. They went to Urea and reported exactly where the Texans had gone. With the ranchers' help, Urea was able to round up and capture most of them. And, of course, Mission Refugio was no chore to take, now that it was only staffed by a few wounded men. Taking the prisoners with him, he began to proceed towards Goliad. Fannin still waited there. No news had he received from King or Ward whatsoever. For all he knew, they were still under siege by the Mexicans. But Houston had ordered him to withdraw to Victoria. What was he to do? The 16th of March dragged by, then the 17th, but when the 18th dawned, with still no message from his officers, Fannin began thinking about pulling out. King and Ward were just going to have to fend for themselves. There was nothing he could do to help them. His force was impossibly smaller than Urea's. The baggage carts were loaded, the oxen were hitched up, everything was prepared to go. At the last moment, Fannin faltered. Just one more day. Well, the day came. And with no message. That following morning, the whole garrison of Fort Defiance was trickling out of the gates at a steady stream. All that was left to defy the advance of the Mexicans now was the empty shell of the building. For 4 miles they plodded along the dusty track northward. But the oxen were growing tired. Normally, a well-fed, well-rested ox should be able to pull happily along for at least 15 miles in a day. But these were no such oxen. They had been left hitched to the carts all the day before this, just standing and waiting for something to happen. They had not had enough food, rest, or water to sufficiently prepare them for this trip, and that was clearly beginning to show. Fannin called a halt, and the oxen were allowed to crop at the sweet grasses of the prairie for a little while. That is when General Urea arrived. The Texans suddenly spotted him coming towards them over the plains, with an army nearly twice the size of their own. Fannin needed to make a plan, and fast. There was a line of forest nearby their position, but a quick calculation told him that reaching this before the Mexicans reached them would be an impossible feat. They were going to have to stick it out in the open. The wagons were quickly driven together so as to form a square of protection around the Texan troops, and they prepared to stick it out to the last. The wagon ring had become their new Fort Defiance. This Battle of Toledo was a tough business. It raged all the rest of that day, with the guns only going quiet again at night. 60 of the 450 Texans had wounds to bind, Fannin himself among them. There was not sufficient equipment to care for the poor fellows. There was not even water to clean the wounds, let alone to drink. with food and ammunition at dangerously low levels as well. The future was not a bright thing to look upon. Yet, in the council Fannin held with his officers in those bleak night hours, not a man advocated for escape or retreat. They would not leave their wounded behind, no matter how bad things got. They would die or live through this together. On Uriah's part, the rest of his artillery had just come up. He was willing to put it to use, if needed, but he preferred not to if possible. At sunrise, he tried a new tactic, parading the big guns out in full view of the Texans. His message was clear. Fannin knew that to resist further was to be blown to smithereens. The white flag was raised in the Texan camp, and they submitted under those dishonorable terms of unconditional surrender. Uriah, however, was no Santa Anna. He didn't have a vendetta against these Texans, and needless bloodshed was the thing he wished to avoid. He promised the Texans that they would be treated decently, as prisoners of war. Their arms were handed over, and they were marched away to prison. Back to their own Fort Defiance, actually. It must have been a bitter morsel to swallow. A week later, on Palm Sunday of March 27th, the prisoners were called out of their cells to parade outside the fort. The orders were strange, but they marched as they were told. They really had no choice, anyhow. When they were told to stand before the Mexican firing squads, the whole picture became clear. Santa Anna would have none of Uriah's mercy. When he heard that Uriah had spared the Texans captured after the battles of Refugio and Toledo, he had sent very sharply to the general, commanding him to obey orders. He had said no prisoners, and he meant it. And Uriah caved. He broke his promise. Fannin and almost every one of his men were shot down in cold blood. Uriah managed to spare and smuggle away only a small handful of them. This Goliad massacre was one of the saddest events in the history of this Texan war for independence. But while Sam Houston and his volunteers still breathed, hope was alive. They were the last ones left to stand in the gap for Texas.